Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I've been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to march forward through another offseason together. As always, you can find our 100% free 24/7 boots on the ground coverage of the Jaguars every single day on social media, such as Facebook and Twitter, at Jaguars on SI. And you can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. Hello and welcome to today's episode. My name is John Shipley, of course, and today, one final putting the bow on the draft class. I'm going to go pick by pick for the Jaguars, not necessarily give a grade, but give my thoughts on each pick a little more fleshed out, a little more individually, and what I really think about the Jaguars' entire process and how things shaped out for the first draft of the James Gladstone and Liam Cohen era. Obviously, when we look back in this class in 5 years, 10 years, however many years, this class will be defined by the move for Travis Hunter. There is absolutely zero question about that. The Jaguars gave up premium capital to get Hunter. They obviously swapped first-round picks, but they also sent a first-round pick for next year. They sent a second-round pick. They effectively used 2 first-round picks and a second-round selection to draft Hunter, if you're not factoring in all the other picks that were evenly swapped, etc. So this class will be remembered for how that trade ages and for how well Hunter plays and whether he can truly be that elite dynamic player at both positions in the NFL. Nobody's ever done it. Obviously, some players have taken snaps both ways. His head coach, Deion Sanders, in college being one of them. But there's never been a prospect like Travis Hunter, who's a legitimate top 3 type of pick, would go number 1 overall in most drafts, is the top talent overall in most drafts at both wide receiver and cornerback. Travis Hunter is one of the best prospects I've seen. I've been, participating and evaluating draft classes since 2013. Clearly don't have a, unblemished record in terms of evaluation. So you can only take my word for it for as much as you want. But I think he's one of the best, most special, rarest prospects I've seen. To that point, yeah, I do get did they send too much for a non-quarterback? I've always said that just value-wise and efficiency-wise, you're better off trading back than trading up unless it is for a quarterback in your team. Obviously, with the need, then you can kind of meet the value as long as the pick pans out. But on the other hand, as we've discussed before and as I said in my observations on the pick, if James Gladstone, moves back enough, otherwise, in his time as the Jaguars general manager, then he's still in relatively good shape. He really is. Right now, looking, at the Jaguars draft pool for next year, they have a second-round pick, 3 third-round picks, a 4th-round pick, 2 5th-round picks, a 6th-round pick, and 3 7th-round picks. So altogether, they have 11 picks next year, including 4, let's say, near the top 100. We'll see, obviously, where that last pick, that compensatory pick, plays out. But the Jaguars, if you move back enough to replenish the draft capital, you can be aggressive moving up. The great general managers do it. Howie Roseman does it. It is what the good GMs do. So I understand the risk in here for Travis Hunter, but I also, I think he can be an Odell Beckham, Justin Jefferson, receiver. That's apart from being an elite cornerback who can change the game there as well. Am I expecting him to be a full-time both-way starter at any point in his career, really? No. But I do think he'll be out there on defense in certain situations and, when the game's really on the line. Special ball skills, special instincts, special athleticism. He's a special player. Moving on into, obviously, day 2, I was really impressed by the trade, with the Detroit Lions netting an extra, 2 third-round picks next year. I know some trade charts have it out there as not that much of a lopsided trade, but I think that's just discounting future picks. Even if the Lions win the Super Bowl, that's still a valuable pick for the Jaguars. It's still on day 3 where the meats of the drafts normally are. So I thought that was well done. Taking Tulane safety Caleb Ransaw. Now, I didn't know much about Ransaw ahead of the draft. I've kind of adopted in many ways, when it comes to the top picks, familiarizing myself more so after the draft. Just in terms of knowing more about their fit, etc. So he wasn't somebody I had a lot of exposure to before the draft. Watching his tape, since the draft, since the Jaguars took him, and since, hearing them describe the role, they think he can play all over the secondary, obviously. And they've said, James Gladstone and Liam Cohen have said, he's going to start out at safety. They had a big need at safety, a major need. Entering the offseason, they've now invested in that in both free agency and the draft. He's a really sound tackler, physical player, good click and close, really good metrics, doesn't have much ball production. So I think, you're wondering how much of a playmaker is he, but just in terms of a reliable player who can maybe provide some consistency and reliability at a position the Jaguars have really struggled at, I think he makes a lot of sense. Wyatt Milam, I actually think one of their best picks. Travis Hunter, to me, is the best pick because he was the best player in the draft. To me, I'd probably put Milam right, second behind it. There are some others I was really liked, but he's somebody. Interviewed him at the NFL Scouting Combine, was really impressed by him. People I know who evaluate entire draft classes and who do this kind of scouting, across the board high on him. He has a lot of college production, hasn't allowed a sack in the last 2 years or whatever. Started a lot of games at West Virginia. Nick Saban said he was trying to get him to enter the portal for years. So Nick Saban effectively tampering to try to secure, this guy. I think he was available at pick 89 because, obviously an offensive tackle who is projecting more as an offensive guard at the next level. I think that he has a legitimate chance to really go in there and compete for that starting left guard job. But that was with Cleveland. We'll see over the course of training camp. But even if he doesn't start right away, he's somebody who I think, you can very, in the near soon future, see somewhere in the starting lineup along the interior offensive line. Also has the versatility to play tackle in a pinch. Isn't ideal there because of his length. But another guy who's played multiple positions, etc., he's somebody who I am really interested by, and I think that was a really good process. Round 4, they take Bashul Tuden out of Virginia Tech. Excuse me if I am mispronouncing. I promise I will get it. Tuden, excellent speed, 4.32, even faster than Brian Thomas Jr. somehow. One of the biggest home run hitters in the draft class. The Jaguars talked about how they think they improved their striking distance in the draft on offense. And to me, what they're clearly saying is they think they can now score really from anywhere on the field. Tuden's that kind of player. If he finds a crease, he has the kind of speed, he can turn any play into a touchdown. Obviously, had some fumbling issues at Virginia Tech, but I, pretty much around the board saw third-round projections for him. It was a good pick by the consensus. A lot of guys that people had in the third round. You even saw rumors out there of the Dallas Cowboys potentially being interested in the second round. I think, even Gladstone admitted that after he ran his time, at the combine, he didn't expect him to be there in the fourth round. So, what it means for Travis Etienne, Tink Bigsby, etc., we'll see. It might not necessarily mean anything because they needed to add another back to the mix. They only had 3 running backs on the roster entering the offseason. Keelan Robinson, there's just no tape on him in the NFL, so he's just a big unknown. So they had to add some bodies. Liam Cohen effectively used 3 running backs with Tampa Bay last year. I thought the Tuden pick made a lot of sense. It was very obvious they were going to draft a running back at some point. But frankly, and this isn't to compare them, because Genty is obviously the better prospect. But Ashton Genty at number 5 or a talent like Tuden at the top of the 4th round. That is why throughout this entire draft process, when I thought about them taking Genty at 5, I couldn't shake that. I don't think it would have been, a good move. At pick 107 in the 4th round, Jack Kaiser, the one pick I wouldn't say scratching my head, but, in my opinion, unless he just explodes during training camp and earns like a prominent role in the defense, any linebacker you drafted this year was probably going to make an impact first and foremost to special teams. And that's where Kaiser is obviously going to make a huge impact. He was, I think, Notre Dame's Special Teams Player of the Year in 2023. Makes a big impact in that regard. They had to replace Caleb Johnson, etc. All that makes sense. But taking said player in the 4th round with some other needs otherwise, I agree with don't reach for a need just because. But I will say I was surprised how early they went linebacker. And it's absolutely a need in the long-term future, past 2025. Chad Muma's expiring contract, Devin Lloyd expiring contract unless they pick up his 5th-year option here in a few days, which we don't expect them to. So, Ventrell Miller expiring contract next year. Foray, obviously, another year older. It's definitely a position of need moving forward. I was just surprised how early they went for it. And then their last 4 picks on, day 3, Jalen McLeod, Rayon Lane, Jonah Monheim, LaQuint Allen. McLeod, I think, just looks like, the kind of player Anthony Campanella wants. I think, almost his tape looks like a little bit of a version of Andrew Van Ginkel, to an extent. How Brian Flores, who worked with Campanella, kind of uses him. He's not exactly an off-ball linebacker. He's not exactly an edge rusher. He's kind of like Jalen Walker, honestly. What people, we're seeing him and how I saw him as a 1st-round pick. This is really the 6th-round version, of him. Not compare them necessarily as players, etc., but just, how they can potentially be utilized in the NFL, their skill sets. I'm a fan of his game, after watching him the last few days. I think that pick makes a lot of sense. Lane is one of the best special teamers in the draft. He will make an instant impact on this team as a rookie without even having to play defense. Now, he still has upside on defense. Didn't test like a great athlete, but, a lot of ball production in his career, really good instincts in zone. Another guy add to the safety depth. But where I expect him to make an impact is on special teams. He's absolutely incredible there. I think that was a smart selection because that's where you're trying to improve, at that point in the draft. Center, Jonah Monheim, only played center for the last year. Give some competition for Luke Fortner going into training camp. Luke Fortner entering the last year of his deal. If they're going to be a backup center either way, you save some money. You give Monheim a year to develop. Definitely, I think, an interesting selection. Another guy who's kind of played all over the offensive line. Lastly, LaQuint Allen, I think a really smart 7th-round pick, graded really high in terms of consensus value. Another guy who people seem like they universally had, like a day 3 grade on, but maybe an early to mid day 3 grade as opposed to the last round of the draft. Really interesting guy. A lot of receiving production at Syracuse, really good pass protector. And Liam Cohen noted that they sometimes even flex him out wide as a receiver. So he's a guy who I think potentially can develop into a 3rd down kind of back and maybe find some packages early on in his career to contribute on passing downs. Thank you guys for listening to today's episode. My name is John Shipley. As always, we'll be back next time.